Good morning, Sweetwater. It's a real privilege to be here. I want to thank the superintendent and the board members for inviting me. I was sharing with them how important good leadership is, and I know you've gone through some tough times recently with leadership. So it's good to see people who are committed to this community in leadership roles. So I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank Dr. Fulcher, who picked me up late last night, and for his work here in expanding equity. And I think he made it clear that excellence can never be compromised in the name of equity. It is about recognizing that when we pursue equity, that we make excellence possible for more and more of our students. And then finally, I want to thank all of you, the staff that makes this work possible, for your commitment. You get a short summer in Sweetwater, don't you? And I was trying to get my mind around that. This is kind of tough. But they said, no, it works out. You get a few more breaks than other people, too. So I applaud you, particularly those who've been doing this for a long time, for coming back for yet another year. Education is challenging work. And although our society doesn't value the work of educators as it should, you should know that the difference you make with children is key to the kind of nation we'll live in. So thank you for your service. So I want to try to use my time with you this morning to frame the work you're going to be doing this year, this work on equity. And I want to call your attention to what is now familiar to most of us, and that is that equity and equality are not the same. And while that sounds obvious, especially when you see a diagram like that and reminded that some people are left out when you treat everyone the same, there are a lot of policies and practices still in place that perpetuate equality at the expense of equity. How many of you know that you have students right now that are responsible for taking siblings to school? That's their job. And because that's their job, they are often late to school. Not because they are irresponsible, because they are responsible for their siblings. Or kids who are working because they have to make ends meet. Because if they don't work, their family can't pay the bills, and that has an impact on their ability to be in school. That's an equity challenge. And so I want to acknowledge that because the world we live in, the society we live in, is so unequal, pursuing equity is a challenge, but the hard work is figuring out how do we accommodate the differences among our children to make it possible for all of them to be successful and to thrive. Knowing full well they come to us with differences in preparation, differences in temperament and personality and ability, with differences in parental support. But anyone with more than one child is already practicing equity at home. I have 5, so I'm an equity expert. And they range from age 35 to 6, so that's a real challenge, isn't it? Every time we eat a meal together, we have an equity challenge. Because the first one is bigger than me, and so he eats more than everyone else. So he needs to get more. The third one is vegan and gluten-free, so it's very hard to feed him. And the fifth one does not like to eat at all, so you have to chase her around. The goal is for everyone to eat, not to eat the same. When we think about our own children, it becomes obvious we have to acknowledge the differences. Otherwise, we're going to leave some of them out. Some will slip through the cracks. And as parents, we know we have a responsibility to ensure that all of those kids achieve, and not just academically. We want to make sure that they are not just successful in school, but successful in life. And so we know that if our kids get high test scores, but they're unethical, or they're unhappy, we haven't succeeded. If our kids get into the best colleges, but they're strung out on drugs, we still haven't succeeded. Because equity is about seeing the whole person, the whole child, and recognizing that their intellectual needs are also impacted by the psychological, the emotional, the physical needs. And so when we have that kind of lens, we're able to see how the work has to change to accommodate the differences. And so part of us have to also recognize that the reality is some people start out way ahead than others, don't they? My fifth child is starting out way ahead of her siblings because I'm older, so I have more resources now than I did when I was 22 and had my first son. I didn't even have health insurance then. And so my fifth daughter, she can explain global warming. She can explain why it is that you should never swim off the coast of Australia because the box jellyfish is there. She is reading Harry Potter at 6. And so when people meet her, they always say to us, you have a gifted daughter. I said, yeah, her gift is that she has 2 parents with PhDs. That's her gift. What a gift. Here's what I know, and here's what all of us know. There are kids who live in trailer parks and housing projects, who come from single-parent households, who don't speak English, who live in homeless shelters, who also have gifts. Our job is to cultivate the gifts and the talents in all kids. So to do that work, we've got to eliminate the barriers that prevent it and make it difficult for some kids to excel and to achieve and to learn and to thrive. Sometimes the barriers are obvious and sometimes they're not so obvious. Sometimes they're us. And that's what we need to look at carefully. What role do we play in either eliminating the barriers or erecting them? Are we bridge builders to opportunity or gatekeepers, limiting access? It gets personal, doesn't it? And we have to examine our own personal journeys with equity, because if we disconnect it, sometimes we can't really understand what our kids are going through. So here's part of my personal story. I'm a child of immigrants, like many of your students. And like many of your students, my parents really believed in the importance of education, but neither of them had graduated from high school. Well-read, but not well-educated. And so when we left New York City, living in the housing projects in Brownsville, Brooklyn, that's the part of Brooklyn that still hasn't gentrified, better known for producing boxers like Mike Tyson and rappers like Biggie Smalls than professors, we moved to Long Island. My father thought we'd get into a better community, better schools. Except when we got there, they assumed that because we had Spanish surnames, we couldn't speak English. And therefore, if we couldn't speak English, they didn't know what to do with us. And not speaking English, they thought was like a disability. So they put my brother and I in special education. Well, I was only 5, so I didn't really mind. But my older brother knew something was wrong, and so he went back to my father. And right away said, we're in the wrong class. We're not doing any work. But my father, being an immigrant who made the mistake of trusting the schools, said, you do as you're told. You behave yourself. And so he came back the next day, same thing, we're not doing any work. And now he gets threatened with a pow-pow. You're going to get a spanking for this. And finally, on the 3rd day, when he brings up a paper airplane and said, this is all we did today, my father realized maybe something is wrong. So he decides he needs to go to the school, and because he was a police officer in New York City, he's better go in uniform. And so he does. And after hearing their explanation for why they're in this class, he said, I want to see the class. And he goes to see, and he sees that it's nothing more than a holding tank for children, that the school doesn't want to serve or doesn't know how to serve. So we insist that we be removed. They said, well, before you remove them, we have to test them. They said, we'll test them. And so they test my brother and I, and they discover that we're not supposed to be in special ed, we're supposed to be in gifted classes. Now, my older brother, Felipe, ends up going to Harvard University. I end up going to Brown University. What would have happened had my father not intervened? Who intervenes for your kids when their parents don't show up to make sure they're getting what they need? Each of you, if you're serious about this equity walk, have to be guardians and advocates for the children who have none. Because we know when that doesn't happen, kids with potential, kids with ability, kids who have promise, languish. And that promise doesn't get fulfilled. Now, part of my equity journey is also professional. I decided while I was in college I wanted to be a teacher. And I did it mostly for practical reasons. I thought I needed to be able to have a job that will be steady, because I came from a working class background and I didn't know if a degree in sociology was going to work out. So I said, let me get a teaching credential. And I started teaching in Providence, Rhode Island at Central High School, what they called the worst high school in the city. But I loved it. I loved it because I loved the kids, I loved the challenge, and I loved history. Well, my mentor teacher came to me and said, when you teach American history, your job is to get the kids from the Revolutionary War in September to the Vietnam War in June. That's your job. Here's the book. I'll be back watching. I said, wait, what about the Constitution? He said, don't get caught up in the Constitution. The Constitution's too complicated. You got to be at Civil War by Christmas. I said, well, the Civil War is really complicated. He said, you don't get it. You got to be a Great Depression by Easter. And then I got it. He didn't care if the kids actually learned history. He only cared if I got through the book. Now, the good thing for me was I knew he wasn't going to be in the back watching. He was going to leave me alone. And although I was only 21 years old, I knew that when the door closed, I had the power, like you do. Do you know what to do with that power? I decided I was going to make history come to life. I decided I was going to get those kids to love history as much as I did. And I would do that by making history come to life and matter for them. And I invited friends in to come in dressed as characters from history. And when Thomas Jefferson showed up, they had a lot of questions about Sally Hemings. They wanted to know, how old was she? Because when kids understand the importance of what they're learning, they develop an appreciation that extends beyond the test, doesn't it? And so I appreciated the value of it early on. And I remember one day I was enjoying my class, and I said to a colleague during a passing period, I said, my class is going so well, but I got this one kid. This one kid who's a pain in my butt. He's constantly disrupting the class. He's harassing other kids. If I could just get rid of him. And he said, who? I said, that boy, and I described him. He said, oh, that boy, his mother's boyfriend beats him up all the time. Well, that's all he had to tell me to know that I needed to find a way to make a relationship with that student. And he didn't know why I was so interested in him suddenly, and why it was I was asking him to help me to do different things. I could not change what was happening at home. I could change what was happening in my classroom. And as I learned as a brand new first-year teacher, kids learn through relationships. They will work for people they know care about them. And so I saw the power of education early on. And so I went off to graduate school at Berkeley to get my PhD, and I subbed up part-time, but I found subbing hard. And so then I got offered a position as chief of staff to the mayor of Berkeley. And I took it, because I thought I could solve the problems facing the city. And we had big problems, same kinds of problems we have today. We had problems with homelessness and drug trafficking and violence in the community. And I was there on the front lines dealing with all of it, and I quickly realized I wasn't solving the problems. I was being blamed for the problems. I thought I needed to go back to grad school and finish up. But one day I was approached by an administrator in the Berkeley Public Schools. He was a person who had a reputation as being an advocate for kids who were not served well. And he came to me because he had just been assigned to become the principal of the continuation school as a punishment. Superintendent thought they would get him to retire quickly. But instead of being moved to retire, he was rejuvenated. And he comes to me with one of his students and says, Pedro, I want you to meet this young man and convince him to run for student body president of my school. I had been student body president at UC Berkeley. But I meet the young man, and I'm immediately wondering, because he doesn't look presidential to me. He's got thick gold chains, gold rings, gold teeth, and a beeper. This was the 80s. And I figure anybody with this much gold and a beeper is probably doing something illegal. And why would you want him to be the president of the school? But I trust my friend, and I start talking to the young man. After a few minutes, it's clear this young man is highly intelligent, he's charismatic, he's the type of kid who's going to run the school either way. And the principal is wise enough to realize I need this young man on my side, not against me. So I'm so taken by what this principal's trying to do. I said, I'd like to visit your school. He said, oh, please come visit. I need help. So a day later, I show up. And I learned that this continuation school, in a community that takes pride in being one of the first in the country to integrate schools, is totally segregated. And it's hard to tell it's a school at all, because there are more kids in the parking lot smoking, and not just cigarettes, than there are kids in class. And I walk the halls and I talk to teachers and say, what's it like to work here? One teacher says, it's fine, it's great. We get out at 1:30. Kids don't bother us, we don't bother them, everyone gets along here. So I go back to my friend George Perry. I said, George, you got a big problem here. This school is a mess. He said, I only have 2 problems. I said, what's that? He said, the teachers and the kids, that's it. I said, George, those are 2 big ones. He said, I can work with the teachers. I said, how are you going to do that? He said, I'm just going to remind the teachers why they got in this work in the first place and insist that they teach every day. He said, what I don't know how to do is get the kids from the parking lot back into class. He said, can you help me with that? I said, I'm not sure, but I could try. So I go out into the parking lot, and I start talking to kids. And the first thing I learned surprises me, and that is all of the kids are already old enough to quit if they want to, because you have to be at least 16 to go. But they're not quitting because they haven't given up on the idea that they need a degree. They still have hope. So I believe that that gives us a chance to reach them. But the second thing I learned disturbs me. That is that all of these kids are concerned with their survival. Many of them are trying to support themselves, support their families, and struggling doing that, and some of them are doing it illegally. So I go back to George. I said, the key here is we have to show the kids how they can use education to support themselves economically, financially. He says, well, I don't know how to do that. I said, well, I have an idea. I'd been in the mayor's office. I knew that the city of Berkeley was negotiating with Bayer Laboratories. Bayer produces a bunch of pharmaceutical products, including Bayer aspirin. And they wanted to expand operations in Berkeley. So I said, I'm going to go to the CEO, who was German, because it's a German firm. And I proposed that they develop a biotech academy for our high school so our kids could get entry-level jobs in the industry. And because it's German, they said, well, this makes sense. This is what we do in Germany. This is the way kids get access to technical fields, is through high school. And so we started to build this partnership that is now 27 years old, that now involves 7 high schools, 5 community colleges, 3 biotech firms, and 1 Cal State University, and is considered a national model. So when I talk about excellence through equity, it is, for me, not simply a slogan. I think by now we know we've had too many slogans in education that have become to mean not much. No Child Left Behind was a good one, wasn't it? But we left a whole lot of kids behind. I often remind people, that slogan didn't come from the Bush administration, it came from the Children's Defense Fund. But when Marian Wright Edelman came up with the slogan, leave no child behind, she didn't mean test them as frequently as possible. She really did mean we have to think about health and nutrition and all the things our kids need. And that's what equity is about. It's about acknowledging that the academic needs of a child are connected to their physical needs, to safety, to their well-being. And again, that makes it hard because we know there are lots of issues out there we can't control. But sometimes we focus so much on what we don't control and we ignore the things we do control. And so equity is about trying to compensate for some of those disadvantages. We may not be able to make up for an absent father, but we can make sure that a child who has no father has a mentor at school. We can't make sure that those kids eat on the weekend, but we can make sure they eat during the week. Not good enough. But education in this society is constantly working against the stream. So when we say we're committed to equity, we have to acknowledge nobody else is committed to equity, just us. That's why it's so hard. But we know, too, that education can be powerful and that poverty is not a learning disability. There is absolutely no evidence that because you're poor, you can't learn. And so I want to encourage you, stay focused on the outcomes, and the outcomes are not just academic, they are developmental. And be clear, equity is not about lowering the standards. It's not about treating everybody the same. It's not about mediocrity or something only for poor kids of color. I'm seeing lots of affluent, high-achieving kids at UCLA now who can't function because they're on antidepressants, because they're stressed out. No one really prepared them for college because although they were prepared academically, they weren't prepared psychologically. They have very little in the way of resilience. When we see the whole child, we recognize that all children need the benefit of being challenged and supported. And when we have that kind of lens, it makes it possible for us to ensure that all kids have the opportunity to be successful, and it's closing the opportunity gaps ultimately that makes equity achievable. There are, of course, obstacles, and the obstacles are familiar, and we got to name them sometimes. Politics is an obstacle, and I don't just mean big Democrat versus Republican politics. Sometimes it's school politics, like whom's teaching whom. You know, education is one of the few fields where we take our best teachers and deliberately assign them to our best students, and take our least experienced teachers and assign them to work with our most challenging kids. Sorry, new teachers out there, I didn't warn you if you didn't know that. You know, UCLA has a great teacher ed program. We produce great novices. We don't produce master teachers. And it gets me so concerned because I see those bright-eyed, cheerful novices come out, and they come out, they're so idealistic, and by the end of the day, they look like they're 55. And they're stressed out, and they don't want to teach anymore, because they were assigned the most challenging class. You know what it looks like when we have a commitment to excellence through equity? We do what they did in Fontana, at Fontana High School. Fontana High School. 4,000 kids at the high school, all Latino, all low income, highest AP calculus scores in the county. That was 3 years ago. I heard things have changed. I asked the superintendent, how do you get the highest AP calculus scores? He said, well, we got the best calculus teacher. And I convinced him to start teaching 2 sections of 9th grade math. I said, why? He said, because until I did, we only had 6 or 7 kids in calculus. We needed a strong teacher in the 9th grade to build the road to calculus. Who's teaching your 9th graders? Who's teaching the kids who don't speak English? Who's teaching the kids who are struggling and can't read while they're in high school? Are they skilled, or are they simply overwhelmed? When we are committed to equity, we take these issues on, and we don't pretend. We don't see them. How many of you have helped your own kids through college applications? Stressful, isn't it? I've done it 4 times now, and each time we cried. Cried a long time, trying to figure it out. And I know about this. I'm a college professor. And how many of you know out there that there are kids in your school who are also stressed? They don't understand financial aid. They don't understand the application process, and they have no one to help them. And what's the counselor to student ratio here in Sweetwater? 360 to 1. Hard to give those kids the attention they need, when it's time to apply. Have we organized our schools to meet the needs of our kids? You know what a lot of wealthy people do now? They don't go to the counselor. They hire someone privately to coach their kids through the process. That's a very lucrative profession now, right? To coach kids through the process. They'll even write the application for an additional fee. There's a reason why the privileged do well, isn't there? So if we're committed to equity, we have to address these issues too. And so I don't want to pretend it's easy, but I do know that there are traditions, there are capacity issues, and there are beliefs. I love the belief statement I saw you read together. So powerful. Now my challenge to you is it real? Or are those just words? I go to so many schools, they got great mission statements. They're committed to all kids and dedicated to changing the world, and it's not really happening, but it's a nice statement. The real challenge is whether or not we're able to make it real, make it matter for our kids. So I encourage you, ask yourselves, are we doing what it takes to really pursue equity and excellence for kids? A lot of that has to be based on what we know works. And we have good research out there now about what works to serve all kinds of kids. The University of Chicago has studied school reform for the last several years. The question they've asked is, many schools have been reformed, not all schools have gotten better. My colleague Charles Payne wrote a book, So Much Reform, Why So Little Change? Well, some schools have changed. And the schools that have gotten better and stayed better, there are certain characteristics they have in common. And here they are. First, they have a coherent system for guiding instruction. Coherence. That means teachers aren't doing their own thing. That means we're not leaving teachers by themselves to figure it out. They're planning together. They're clear about what needs to be taught, what skills kids need to acquire, and what to do when they don't learn it. Second, there's ongoing development of the professional capacity of the staff. Because to become a master teacher, it takes time, doesn't it? I already said the universities produce novices. Where do our master teachers come from? One of the things we know now is seniority is not good enough, is it? You actually have to be committed to the craft because teaching is art and skill. Teaching is like the martial arts. Some people get the black belt in teaching after 5 years, and some people have been teaching 20 years, they're still a white belt. You want to know who your highly effective teachers are? If you have the courage, just ask the kids. They'll tell you where they're being challenged, where they're being pushed, where teachers are telling them they can do better, because excellence through equity means you challenge the kids. You push the kids. You don't accept slop. Third, strong parent-community ties. Why? Because over 50% of achievement is influenced by what parents do. And that doesn't mean the parents are doing the homework. It does mean that parents get their kids to bed on time. Parents are checking in and letting the kids know, I care about what you do, this is important, as my parents did. Parent relationships matter and have to be rooted in trust and respect in order for our parents to reinforce the importance of education at home. Fourth, student-centered learning climate, a culture in the schools that lifts the morale of the staff, because I've never seen a high-performing school with low morale. Have you? No. A culture that affirms the values that are so important for respect and for safety and for empathy and integrity. A culture where the kids believe it's cool to be smart. Do we have that culture? I'm glad to hear that was a quick yes. But I only heard one yes. Here's what we know. Cultures can't be imposed on schools. And you already have a culture. What's the culture like in the lunchroom? On the playground? In the teacher's lounge? How's it feel when you walk the halls? Does it feel safe? Again, ask your kids, do you feel safe here? Not just physically safe, psychologically, emotionally. Is the classroom a safe place to ask for questions? Safety is so important. But it's not just safety. It's the relationships. Finally, shared leadership. Shared leadership because it's not simply about the superintendent or the principals, it's about every member of the staff, including the receptionist, including the custodian. Every member of the team understanding what my role is. How do I contribute to the greater good of this organization? What the research shows is that when these 5 ingredients are in place, they call them the essential ingredients, schools improve and have sustained improvement over time. So what does it look like when we do this work well? Let me start with the first one, when there's coherent instructional guidance for teachers. As I said, teachers are clear about what is taught, they share ideas on how it's taught, they intervene when students don't learn, and students are empowered as learners. Empowered as learners. Which means that they are not simply seeking to pass a course, they are seeking to excel. They want to own the material. It means teachers are planning together. They're analyzing student work together, asking questions respectfully of each other, because we know we don't get better when we work in isolation. We get better through our collaboration. And we also know that many of our kids don't learn when we simply talk, like my mentor teacher did. He confused teaching with talking. He thought if I just covered the book, I'd done my job, and I knew very well that was not good enough. And the research shows that too. Lecture is the least effective way to learn something, because that's not the way most of our kids actually learn. Now, let me be clear, universities model the worst teaching, don't we? Right? That's what we do. So don't use the university as an example here. You have harder work to do. And that means you've got to figure out ways to engage the kids, to interact with the kids, because that's the way our kids actually learn things. How does a child learn to play a video game? Do they download a lecture? Or do they learn by doing? Do they learn through asking questions and collaborating? Do they learn by making mistakes? And ultimately, when they learn through mastery. And so when we bring those kinds of practices together in our rooms look different. They start to look less like what my colleague Roland Thorpe called the cemetery method. Right? You know the cemetery method, line them up in rows, keep them as still as possible. And they start to look much more engaged, not like this, not chaos, but where kids are moving and actively engaged and talking, because that's how kids actually learn things. I saw this at Hollenbeck Middle School in LA, in East LA. This was a 90-minute algebra class. All the kids on task. Teacher's so good she can stand in the back and talk to me. If she wanted to, she could start doing yoga, because she doesn't have to hover over the kids. The kids know exactly what they're supposed to do. In some schools, only the honors kids get to learn like this. These were all English learners from one of the poorest communities in Los Angeles, communities that have lots of undocumented people, lots of people, kids who don't speak English. But she knows that if she creates the right environment, not only will the kids learn the math, they will also develop the social skills, because that's what they're doing right here, because you can't work in a group and not learn how to cooperate and respect people. You know that learning to work with people you don't like is an important social skill? Right? And because she has the kids engaged this way, guess what? There are minimal disruptions, because class time is work time. This is the highest form of classroom management. So many times we're focused on classroom management, it's about behavior control, and we completely forgot about engagement, getting them working. These kids were so busy working that when the bell rang, they were disturbed. They hadn't packed up 10 minutes early. And so who are your teachers that can teach like this? Some teachers look at a picture like this and they get scared. They say, this makes me nervous. All you need is a fart in this room and the whole thing could blow up, right? She's not worried about that. She's prepared them for all kinds of occurrences. And because of that, the kids are able to excel. And we know that when we're able to teach in these ways and use technology in ways that enhance what we do, we can differentiate support for kids. Because equity can't be about treating them all the same. We know they come with different needs, and we can't simply tell to teachers, differentiate like it's magic. We have to illustrate what kind of learning environment, what kind of strategies allow us to get kids to learn together, so teachers can work one-on-one or in smaller groups with kids who need more time and more help. This is not easy work. It takes high skill. And again, some of you have it and some of you don't yet. Those of you who don't should find out, who has that? Because I want to be able to teach like that too. I want my kids to come away saying, wow, what a lesson. Thank you so much. That was a hell of an inspiring day. Thank you. How often does that happen? I was at a school in LA, Social Justice Humanitas High School. Again, 100% low income, 100% Hispanic, fourth highest graduation rate in Los Angeles. Right? Fourth highest. It's the only school in Los Angeles where kids evaluate their teachers. I asked the teachers, what's it like to work here? They say, it's fantastic. This school has no attrition. People are trying to get into that school. Teachers work together, plan together. I said, what's the hardest thing about working here? They said, the feedback from the kids. They don't hold back. One girl whispered to me, she said, that teacher hasn't talked to me for 2 years because I told her she was disorganized. But she's getting better and we're on speaking terms now. I asked the kids, what's it like to go to school here? They said, we feel safe, we feel supported because they spend the first 3 days of school doing community building. Right? Community building. And because of that, kids will share things that they would have never shared otherwise. They'll let them know, you know what, I'm actually living with my grandmother. I'm actually being molested by my uncle. And now the staff is building those relationships. And I said, well, how do you give up learning time for this? He said, we don't give up any learning time. We just tell them they have to come 3 days ahead of time. I said, they do? He said, yep. And so they don't just follow the rules because they know the rules don't work for serving a population like this. They've designed systems and structures to support kids, and because of that, they achieve more than most schools. And so what are the schools here in Sweetwater that are doing this kind of work? What are the classrooms where it's happening? Where teachers are focused on the evidence of learning. You know, evidence-based teaching looks different than faith-based teaching. You know, I'm all for faith. But if we're just praying and hoping, I hope they did well this year, I hope they did well this year, it's probably not going to be good enough. When you focus on the evidence, you teach like a coach. Right? And the coaches, how many coaches are in the room today? Right? Lots of coaches. They're sitting together, too. They're all sticking together. If a kid can't shoot a free throw, you don't just say you flunk at free throws. You say, no, we're going to do it more. We're going to look at your form. You're going to practice. You're going to practice because the coach gets it. What the child can do, what the student can do is a reflection of what the coach has taught that athlete. Same thing is true in theater or music. Right? We understand that the performance of our kids is related to what we have done as teachers. Well, guess what? That's true in math, too. That's true in science. That's true in English. When the kids can't read, it means we haven't taught them to read. I know that's hard to hear, isn't it? But you know what happens when teachers have the ego to believe that when you're in my class, there's going to be a difference made? Wow. Amazing things can happen. How many of you had a teacher at one point in your career who got you to overcome a fear, your dislike, your inability to do a subject, and got you to be good at it? Anybody have a teacher like that? Look around the room. Lots of us did. Think about that teacher, how that teacher got you to become better at what you were doing and overcome those fears. I had a teacher like that in 8th grade, Mrs. Harris, taking algebra. Mrs. Harris started the class by saying, you know, you kids are lucky because I'm the best teacher in the school. I'm the best one. She said, how many of you struggle in math? And I sheepishly raised my hand. I didn't want her to know, but she said, okay, you're going to sit up front. I want all the kids who struggle to sit up front because I'm going to be checking on you regularly. Because she understood if you didn't know the material in September, you definitely wouldn't know it in May. And Miss Harris wore a lot of perfume. So if you weren't on task, you're going to smell like Miss Harris by the end of the day, so you better be paying attention. Right? The good thing about teaching is it's idiosyncratic. You don't have to do it the same ways. It's art and skill. You get to bring personality. You get to bring your experience, your life experience to the work. That's the power of teaching, is the creativity of it. Stop focusing on student achievement. Does that sound too radical? Achievement is the outcome we're after. What's the means to get there? The means to get there is engagement. Get them engaged. Get them excited about learning. Wow, you know what happens when kids get engaged? Great things are possible because engagement is multidimensional. It's behavioral. I saw you have Avid. I've seen the Avid shirts. Let's hear it for Avid. Avid is a great means of teaching kids how to be organized, how to take ownership. You know what? When Avid works well, we spread those skills around to all our classes. We don't just hoard it for the Avid kids. We say, no, all kids need those skills. All of them. Engagement is also cognitive. Do they understand it? Can they connect what they're learning to what they need to learn next? Can they apply it? What do their questions tell us about the depth of understanding? And engagement is emotional, it's affective. Because when our kids are engaged and they care about what they're doing, they work harder. You know what? Teaching gets easier when our kids are working hard, isn't it? When you're teaching a willing learner, it's so much easier, isn't it? Than trying to force feed someone. You know what? I'll tell you right now, that you cannot make kids learn. I've tried. It doesn't work. I've tried it with my own son. It does not work. But you can sometimes trick them into learning, can't you? You can make it so damn interesting that even that kid who was half asleep was like, whoa, I got to pay attention. This is too good to miss. One of my former students, Ernest Morrell, teaching high school in Oakland, he was teaching English literature. That was the curriculum for ninth graders. They got to Chaucer, and the kids were reading Canterbury Tales, and they said, we're not having it. This is no good. They were rebelling. They said, these are old white men from England. We don't like it. One girl said, Chaucer's a sexist. Calls women wenches. He said, well, how many of you think Chaucer's a sexist? They all raised their hand, thinking this will get us out of Chaucer. He said, okay, we're going to put Chaucer on trial. And he created a defense team and a prosecuting team, witnesses. A week later, he says, Pedro, I want you to come see this. And I go visit the class. You'd have thought this was the OJ trial going on in there. Kids are passionately debating Chaucer. He did not water it down. They were reading the real thing, but he found a way to make it come to life for the kids. And because he did, they grappled with the words. They grappled with the meaning. They took it seriously, and I'll bet you those kids still know Chaucer to this very day. When we focus on engagement, we teach differently. You know, our policymakers don't get it because they don't understand education. So they've got us fixated on test scores, which got some schools thinking that the real work is test preparation. Well, all the test preparation in the world without content leaves you nowhere. You know, achievement is the outcome. If you wanted to lose weight, would you go and get a really good scale and just weigh yourself as often as possible? Or would you focus on the diet and the exercise? In education, the achievement is like weighing the scale. The engagement is the means to get there. And so ask yourself now, what am I doing to get my kids engaged, to get them motivated? And what are we doing to build our capacity as a staff? That's part of the equity work too. Because when you build the capacity of the staff, you know what happens? The skills of the staff match the needs of the kids. Closing that gap is the key to excellence through equity. And that's what they did in Brockton, Massachusetts. Brockton, Massachusetts, the largest high school in the state with over 4,200 kids. And it's the only one of two urban schools in the state that gets a level 1 rating by the state of Massachusetts, the highest performing state. All the other level 1 rated schools are in affluent suburbs. Brockton is in a depressed, working class, mostly immigrant, black, Latino, poor white community. Brockton is known for fighting. They're the boxers. Rocky Marciano came from Brockton. Marvin Hagler, the middleweight champ, came from Brockton. They got a boxer out front. They had a big fight at their last graduation, teachers' kids fighting in the stands. They still fight in Brockton, but they write too. Because in 1998, the projection was that 75% of the kids at Brockton High School would fail the state exam. And in Massachusetts, if you don't pass the state exam, you don't get a diploma. And so a group of teachers, veteran teachers, went to the principal and said, the only way our kids can pass is if every teacher is trained to be a teacher of literacy. They said, because you can't even access the curriculum in high school if you can't read the material and have the literacy skills. And the principal said, well, good idea, but I can't make the teachers do it. So you don't have to make them. We'll start with those who are willing, and we'll build from there. He said, but I can't pay you. This is a heavily unionized district. You don't have to pay us. We'll work on our own time. We'll train our colleagues. And they did. And in 1998, they began to do this work of literacy across the curriculum. By 2002, when the first exams were given, 50% of the kids passed. So they said, this works. Let's stick with it. And so they did. By 2006, 80% of the kids were passing. Since 2010, over 90% of the kids in Brockton pass the state exam. Over 1/3 of the senior class gets the highest possible score. Those kids get a free scholarship to any public university in the state based on their score. If you can do that in Brockton, sorry, lost my clicker. You can do that in Sweetwater. You can do that because they have shared leadership. It was teacher leadership. When the principal decided she was retiring, she called me, she said, Pedro, I'm leaving. You like to send people to visit, they're not going to find me. I said, are you worried? She said, not at all, because the teachers own this work, not me. And since she's left, the school's made more progress. They got buy-in from the staff, but not immediately. It took time to convince math teachers they had to teach literacy too, to convince PE teachers to teach literacy too. But success bred buy-in, and now they're all doing it. You know what happens when you get in a fight in Brockton? You got to write about it. That's a literacy occasion too. They looked at the data. They examined it. They followed through. They tweaked what they were doing. They didn't sit around blaming the middle schools. So, oh, fix the middle schools. The high school will be fine. They said, no, we're going to meet the kids where they are. And because they did, Brockton is now an example. They were asking the right questions, questions that focused on how to make a difference. And because of that, the same Boston Globe, which once described them as cesspool, in 2009 said, Brockton High School has every excuse for failure, serving a city plagued by crime, poverty, housing foreclosures, and homelessness. But Brockton High, by far the state's largest public high school with 4,200 students, has found success in recent years that has eluded many of the state's urban schools. MCAS scores are soaring, earning the school state recognition as a symbol of urban hope. Now, I believe that literacy is not a gimmick. This is as old as education, isn't it? But I do believe that when there's a staff that's committed to meeting the needs of kids, when we organize ourselves to focus on what are those needs, great things are possible. You know, one of the things that's fortunate about those kids at Hollenbeck Middle School that I mentioned earlier, where those kids were doing that 90-minute algebra class, a lot of those kids will get to go to Garfield High. Garfield High is where Jaime Escalante once taught. And some of you might know the story. If you didn't see Stand and Deliver, go see it. Still a good one. Because for 19 years in a row, he got his kids to take and pass that AP Calculus exam. There's a big mural up at Garfield. And first people to oppose him were his colleagues. They said, not these kids. These kids can't do it. He said, watch me. He was an engineer. He wasn't even a trained teacher. But he understood something that the others didn't. He understood that if he cultivated a sense of ganas in his kids, the desire to learn, the hunger to learn, what some call grit, if he could get those kids to have that, those kids could excel. He also understood he had to inspire those kids. He said, you're the descendants of people who built pyramids. This is part of your heritage. And then he took them to aeronautical labs and said, this is why you need calculus, so you can get jobs like these, and you're not stuck waiting tables. I met one of his former students. She is the only Latina engineer at Boeing working in Southern California. And now, on her part-time, she goes out and does robotics in schools with kids. She said, one teacher made it possible for me to be where I am, so I'm giving back. She said that when he died a few years ago, there's great outpouring of former students who came to honor their former teacher. They all said, you know, their careers were made possible. She said, he used to come to my soccer games. I said, he came to your games? She said, yeah, but not to cheer me on. He told me I stunk at soccer. Go back to math. If one teacher can do that, what can happen when the teachers are all working together, committed to achieving great things for our kids? So let me finish with two quick stories. I know I'm out of time. The first goes back to the cave with those 12 kids. The backstory is this. That coach was a former monk. Buddhist monk. He was trying to take them inside that cave to see a temple and got lost. And the reason why the kids weren't panicked, and when the divers came, they found the kids calm, is because they were meditating with that monk in the cave. And the kids are saying that coach was a savior. He insisted, I'll be the last one out of this cave. He's only 25 years old. I have a 25-year-old son. I don't know if he could have handled that situation. Think about what our teachers can do when we provide the guidance and the support, even under adverse conditions. The last thing comes back to Nelson Mandela. I got to visit South Africa a few years ago. Got to visit Robben Island, the prison off of the coast of Cape Town where he was held for 27 years, 7 years in solitary confinement. Got to go into the cell where he slept on a cement floor. Got to see the rock quarry where he did hard labor, right? Almost went blind from it. And the guide who toured us said he served time with Mandela in there. He said, this prison was created to destroy us, and it became known as our university. I said, they turned a prison into a university? He said, that's right. This is where I got my education. I got my education from other inmates. We were passing information. We were educating ourselves. The guards, Mandela, this is to show you how clever Mandela was. Mandela was an attorney. He convinced one of his guards to become an ally because he provided free legal service to that guard, help him to avoid an eviction. And so he was bringing in books and other information to the inmates. If you can turn a prison into a university, what can you do with real schools? What's possible? I think that sometimes we focus too much on what we can't do and completely all ignore the things we can do. You've signed up for yet another year. Make this year the year where we make a huge difference in the lives of our kids. We're living at strange and difficult times. We are. This country's in turmoil, but when I travel the country and I meet educators, I meet people who understand that we do this work not for the pay, right, but to make a difference. And because you do, and because we know that the future of this country will be determined by what happens in its schools, ultimately, I applaud you for this, and I wish you all the very best this year. Thank you.